this evening, and Miss Meghan McKeogh will present whether gun control is a violation of the natural law.
This fall, the Supreme Court is expected to hear the case New York State and Rifle Pistol Association versus the City of New York. This case concerns a challenge to New York City's ban on transporting a licensed handgun to a home or a shooting range outside the city. This case is very important as it's the first Second Amendment case that the Supreme Court will consider in nearly 10 years since the District of Columbia versus Heller. In that case, the court examined whether the Second Amendment protects an individual right to possess firearms. The court held that the Second Amendment guarantees an individual right to possess a firearm in the home for self-defense. However, it left many unanswered questions regarding other gun control laws. Interestingly, in its opinion, the majority relied on the natural law in arriving at its conclusion. Given the current political climate and the questions left open after the Heller case, this case is being watched by both sides of the gun debate. Gun control proponents want to see much greater limitations placed on an individual right to own guns, while gun right proponents want to see the court rule in a manner consistent with the Heller ruling. Given this background, it is clear that the question of whether current gun control laws violate natural law is a timely and important question. In this thesis, I will defend the assertion that gun control laws violate the natural law and the individual and collective natural right to self-defense. Objection 1. While natural law did hold that the individuals in a state of nature had a broad right to use force for self-preservation, that right is not an inalienable one. Instead, when individuals enter into society, they largely give up this right in return for protection that they obtain under the law. Objection 2. Although the people retained the right to resist tyranny, this was a right that belonged to the community as a whole and rather than individuals. For these reasons, the natural rights tradition provides more support for a collective right than for an individualist interpretation of the Second Amendment. Objection 3. Even if self-defense and the right to replace a tyrannical government were natural rights, guns are not necessary to protect these rights, as we have other less dangerous protections, such as a police force and our political system. On the contrary, quote, "This may be considered as a true palliative of liberty. The right self-defense is a first law of nature, and in most governments it has been the study of rulers to confine this right within the narrowest limits possible. Wherever standing armies are kept up, and the right of the people to keep and bear arms is, under any color or pretext whatsoever, prohibited, if not already annihilated, liberty is on the brink of destruction. I answer that natural law is a philosophy asserting that the certain rights are inherent by virtue of human nature and are endowed by nature, traditionally by God, and that these can be understood universally through human reason. As determined by nature, the law of nature is implied to be objective and universal. It exists independently of human understanding and the positive law of a given state, political order, legislature, or society at large. Historically, natural law refers to the use of reason to analyze human nature in order to arrive at a code of moral behavior. The concept of natural law was documented in ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, including writings by Aristotle and Cicero. References to natural law are also found in the Old and New Testaments of the Bible, and developed by philosophers such as Thomas Aquinas. Modern natural law theories were developed further in the Age of Enlightenment, combining ideas from Roman law along with the more modern philosophies like the social contract theory. Some key philosophers include Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Caesar Beccaria. Furthermore, over time, the concept of natural law became intertwined with the concept of natural rights, and many use natural law synonymously with natural rights, while others distinguish between these two. The point of this summary is that there are a number of theories and ideas that all come to the concept of natural law, but due to the length and complexity of that issue alone, I can't exactly capture all the theories of every proponent of natural law while still answering the question at hand. So I'm just going to use the terms natural law and natural rights synonymously, and have chosen only a few natural law philosophers to discuss. I focused strongly on John Locke because of the great influence he had on our founding fathers and the concepts contained in the Declaration and the Constitution. Self-preservation and the right to self-defense is a basic tenet of natural law. The concepts of self-preservation and the right to defend oneself are as old as time. It is based on the idea that every being must conclude that it is permissible to defend himself when his life is threatened with immediate danger. This is not something that has to be learned or is justified due to man-made law. On the contrary, as Cicero says in his oration defending Milo on a murder charge, quote, "It is a law, not written, but born with us, which we have taken from nature herself, that if our life be in danger from open violence or from the weapons of robbers or enemies, every means of securing our safety is honorable." Notice Cicero doesn't use the word permissible here, he uses the word honorable. Not only is self-preservation a natural right, it is the primary natural right, as asserted by Thomas Aquinas, Thomas Hobbes, and John Locke. In the Summa Theologica, Aquinas included a treatise on law, in which he provided that individuals may discern certain precepts that arise in all human beings, per se, that is, through themselves, not derived, but rather self-evident. Aquinas' precepts of natural law flow from certain, quote, natural inclinations, unquote, of all human beings, beginning with self-preservation. In Aquinas' second article of question 94 in the Summa, it is stated, quote, "Because there is first of all in man an inclination to good, in accordance with the nature which he has in common with all substances, inasmuch as every substance seeks the preservation of its own being according to its nature, and by reason of this inclination, whatever is a means of preserving human life and warding off its obstacles belongs to the natural law." End quote. Similarly, Locke, in his second treatise on government, describes the right of self-defense, quote, "The state of war is a state of enmity and destruction, and therefore, declaring by word or action, not a passionate and hasty, but a sedate, settled design upon another man's life, puts him in a state of war with him against whom he has declared such an intention, and so has exposed his life to the other's power to be taken away by him. It being reasonable and just, I should have the right to destroy that which threatens me with destruction. For by the fundamental law of nature, men being preserved as much as possible, when all cannot be preserved, the safety of the innocent is to be preferred. And one may destroy a man who makes war upon him, for the same reason that he may kill a wolf or a lion, because such men are not under the ties of common law of reason and have no other rule, but that of force of violence, and so may be treated as beasts of prey. That will be sure to destroy him when he falls into their power." End quote. This makes it lawful for a man to kill a thief who has not in the least hurt him, nor declared any design upon his life, any farther than by the use of force, so to get him in his power as to take away his money or what he pleases from him, because it is using force, where he has no right, to get into his power, let his pretense be what it will. I have no reason to suppose that he who would take away my liberty would not, when he had me in his power, take away everything else. And therefore it is lawful for me to treat him as one who put himself into a state of war with me, that is, to kill him if I can. For to that hazard does he justly expose himself. Whoever introduces a state of war, and it is aggressor and is an aggressor in it. However, natural law does not stop there. And this is where the argument starts for those who seek to limit the right of self-defense. Natural law also provides the right to self-defense and is not unrestrained. Thomas Aquinas explains that, in addition to the right to preserve someone's life, quote, "There is also in man an inclination to live in a society, and in this respect, whatever pertains to this inclination belongs to the natural law, for instance, to avoid offending those among whom he has to live," end quote. Therefore, because men live together in society with other men, they can't have absolute freedom to do whatever they want. They must exercise their rights in a way that does not harm the rights of others. And Locke explains this in his ideas where he states, quote, "And here we have the plain difference between the state of nature and the state of war. Men living together according to reason, without a common superior on earth, with authority to judge between them, is properly the state of nature. But force, or a declared design of force upon the person of another, where there is no common superior on earth to appeal for relief, is the state of war, and it is the want of such an appeal that gives man the right of war against an aggressor. Thus a thief, whom I cannot harm, but by the appeal to law, for having stolen all that I am worth, I may kill when he sets on me to rob me. Because the law, which is made for my preservation, where it cannot interpose to secure my life from present force, which, if lost, is capable of no reparation, permits me to my own defense. Of liberty to kill the aggressor, because the aggressor allows not time to appeal to our common judgment. For a remedy in case where the mischief may be irreparable, but when the actual force is over, the state of war ceases between those that are in society, and are equally, on both sides, subjected to the fair determination of the law." End quote. In other words, under natural law, when man lives together, the right to self-defense is limited to those situations that are necessary for the preservation of life. For example, if I were to come home and find that someone was in my house, I wouldn't be justified in going to find that person and then killing them, because I'd have redress in courts for that. On the other hand, if I was at home when someone broke in and someone came out with me with a gun, I would have the right to kill them, because this is the need for self-defense and it's immediate in society. In society, by the way, the justice system could not protect me fast enough in an urgent situation such as this. However, natural law dictates that once the immediate threat is over, so is the right to use deadly force for self-defense. Now, having shown the right to life, not offending the right to life of others, and the right to self-defense can't all exist simultaneously in a violent criminal situation, natural law places a special order to these rights. As Aquinas states, quote, "There is an ordering of the precepts of natural law that corresponds to the ordering of natural inclinations. Self-preservation is placed first because it is the position of primacy, and the natural law is superior in the same way to human law. Certainly man is bound to seek and preserve all goods when possible, but he must preserve his own life first and foremost." End quote. Aquinas continues, quote, "The law of nature is unchangeable with respect to its first principles." End quote. "If man-made laws is opposed to natural law," quote, "then it is no longer a law, but a corruption of law." End quote. In summary, what has been shown is the following. 1. According to natural law, man's highest inclination to good is that of self-preservation, and from this, self-defense. 2. In a society, one must balance self-preservation against the need to avoid killing others. 3. One has the right to use self-defense in response to an immediate threat to his life because the laws of society would not be sufficient to provide immediate protection or legal remedy. 4. If one kills another in order to preserve one's own life and lacked any other reasonable alternative, killing is not only justified, but honorable. 5. Once the immediate threat to life is over, the right to use deadly force is also over. Before I move on to the issue of whether gun control laws violate the natural law relating to self-defense, I will examine a second natural law related to the use of arms, that is, the right to overthrow a tyrannical government. The right to overthrow a tyrannical government is also a tenet of natural law, and following from the personal natural right of self-defense is the natural right of the people of self-defense against a criminal, tyrannical governments. Thomas Aquinas addressed this problem of unjust rulers. He noted that when rulers make laws that violate natural law, they become tyrants. Aquinas concluded that, quote, "A tyrannical government is not just because it is directed not to the common good, but only to the private good of the ruler." End quote. So what did he propose to the people about tyranny? Not only did Aquinas agree with St. Augustine, who said that the subjects of an unjust rule are not obliged to obey the laws since they are not legitimate, but Aquinas went further and argued that the subjects of tyranny acting as a public authority may rebel and dispose of it. However, Aquinas cautioned that people should not do this hastily, but only when the damage done by the tyranny exceeds what may occur in a rebellion. Sound familiar? Aquinas' position was only one of the first justifications of revolution in Western thought. Similarly, Locke holds that under the social contract theory, all political power is initially vested in the community as a whole. The power is given with the trust that it will be used only for the public good, yet the nature of rulers to pursue their own self-interest is something that obviously happens. Because of this, there is a danger that rulers may come to perceive themselves as having a distinct interest from the rest of the community and seek to assert absolute arbitrary power over the people. In this situation, Locke argues that the people have a right to resist and to overthrow the government. Locke explains this concept further as it is a central topic in his second treatise. Under Locke's analysis, when the rulers become tyrannical, they exercise force beyond the bounds of their rightful authority, and thereby place themselves in a state of war with the subjects. Notice the same at-war language he uses here that he uses in his argument about self-defense. Accordingly, because they are at war, the people are entitled to defend themselves under the fundamental natural law of self-preservation to resist such tyranny. Accordingly, the people have the right of revolution, that is, the right to determine that the government has forfeited its authority and should be replaced by a new one, as Locke states. Quote, "There remains still in the people a supreme power to remove or alter the legislative, which they find the legislative act contrary to the trust reposed in them. For all power given with trust for attaining an end, being limited by that end, whenever that end is manifestly neglected or opposed, the trust must necessarily be forfeited, and the power devolve into the hands of those that gave it, who may place it anew where they shall think it best for their safety and security." End quote. Locke concludes that by connecting this right to revolution with the fundamental, sacred, and unalterable law of self-preservation, which empowers the community to preserve itself and its members against oppression. Along these same lines, although not technically natural law, the Declaration of Independence is certainly founded on natural law principles, and especially with the philosophy of John Locke. I mention it here because it's become increasingly relevant when discussing the current state of gun control, as we will later in the thesis. The Declaration of Independence serves as a strong supporting argument for the existence of a right of revolution. It reads, quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed, that when any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its power in such form as to them shall be seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness." End quote. These ideas were strongly influenced by Locke, it is evident. It is clear that Jefferson and all the founding fathers believed that it stems from natural law that man retains the ability to alter or overthrow the government when it attempts to substantially limit or destroy man's natural rights. The Declaration further reads, quote, "Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. When a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariable the same object, uses a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such a government, and to provide the new guards for their future security." End quote. This is a very strong declaration. For the founders, the right to revolt was not a natural right, it was a duty of the people when the government had overstepped its bounds and become tyrannical. In summary, it is clear that by the way of right of self-defense, the natural law also provides for the right to revolt against a tyrannical government. The rights of self-defense and revolution are meaningless without means to exercise them. We have established that natural law recognizes the right of self-defense and revolution, necessarily following from those that is one that cannot defend oneself or an oppressed citizenship can't revolt without having the means of doing so. So if a man naturally possesses these rights of self-defense, man must also possess the right to a reasonable means of self-defense. As Timothy McKeogh says in Natural Rights, Self-Defense, and in the right to own firearms, quote, "This is just another way of saying that I must possess the right to bear arms as a necessary component of the right to self-defense, where arms refers broadly, means reasonably initiating a self-protective action. What all this implies is that the right to bear arms is ultimately a natural extension of the right to life. The natural rights to life, self-defense, and arms are a package deal." End quote. So what is a reasonable means to self-defense? The most basic answer would be anything that would be effective in counteracting someone committing a violent crime, or in the case of revolution, anything that would effectively counter the force of an unjust government. But in order to provide sufficient protection, not only must the method be effective, it must be reliable and easy to access, and much of the time, lethal. Given the fact that many criminal attacks involve a lethal threat, the right to self-defense would be meaningless if it didn't guarantee the right tool, whatever to use was necessary, even a lethal tool to protect our life would be available. Guns certainly seem to fit this description, and as a reasonable means of self-defense, they can be used by almost everyone, do not require a great deal of strength or effort, and are capable of delivering lethal force. The following shows that guns are extremely effective in self-defense and are used frequently for this purpose. While the actual number of defensive guns used each year is controversial because each side of the issue cites different figures and methods for obtaining them, national surveys from the CDC and other public institutions indicate that annually the defensive gun uses by victims range from about 500,000 to more than 2.5 million. The range really depends on the survey and how they define defensive use, versus about 436,000 violent crimes involving firearms. What this shows is that even if you go with the most conservative view of what self-defense is, which would usually mean that a criminal is killed with a gun, there are still far more defensive uses of guns than instances of innocent people being killed by them. I could go on and on proving this point, but I don't have time. Given the effectiveness of the guns, it should be no surprise that guns are most frequently used as methods of self-defense. In light of what has been argued, it's reasonable to conclude that there is a strong moral presumption in favor of private gun ownership as a method of self-defense. The same argument applies for defense from tyranny. Professor and Second Amendment expert Edward Erler describes the right of revolution as, quote, an essential ingredient of the social compact and a right which is always reserved to the people. People can never cede or delegate this ultimate expression of sovereign power. The right of revolution, or even its threat, is the right that guarantees every other right. And if the people have this right as an indefeasible aspect of their sovereignty, then, by necessity, the people also have a right to the means of revolution. Only an armed people are a sovereign people, and only an armed people are a free people. End quote. Clearly, tyrants know this well, as the first step in obtaining power is to take away guns. This has happened throughout history and has even happened very recently. In 2012, under President Hugo Chavez, the Venezuelan National Assembly instituted a law to disarm all citizens. The law went into effect in 2013. Since then, violent crime has soared. Almost 28,000 people were murdered in 2015, with much of those murders being attributed to the government and government-backed guns. Furthermore, the government has blocked citizens from obtaining humanitarian aid, and the police have opened fire on public demonstrations. Without their guns, the citizens have little method for fighting back. Fox News even recently published a piece titled "Venezuelans Regret Gun Ban, a Declaration of War Against an Unarmed Population." It explains just the fact that I'm showing, which is that once an immoral government disarms its citizens, the citizens can easily lose every right, including that most precious one, life. In summary, it is clear that in order for the right to self-defense and the right to revolt to have any meaning, individuals must have a means with which to exercise the rights. The best means in current society is guns. Current gun control laws are against natural right to self-defense and revolt. Now that it's been established that natural law grants the right of self-defense and a right to revolution, as well as the use of guns as the means for self-defense, the final question is whether the current gun control laws violate these natural rights. First, it must be conceded, I have already done so in the first section, that even though there is a natural right to self-defense, that right is not unrestricted. As such, I am not arguing that because of the rights of self-defense and revolution are natural rights, that government can't place any restrictions on gun ownership or use. That in and of itself would violate the natural law principles, as it would enable criminals who seek to use guns to unjustly take away someone's life with easy means for doing so. Because individuals enter society and give up the absolute enjoyment of their rights, in exchange for the protection that society offers, society would be neglecting its duty of protection if it did not, in some way, make it more difficult for people who intend to use guns criminally to harm people to get them. But this was not my question. My question was, do modern gun control laws violate natural law? I choose this in order to address the arguments that you see and hear on a daily basis in news, social media, and public conversation in general. Because we don't have time to discuss every gun control law or proposal, I've decided just to focus on the common gun control methods that are currently being proposed and debated in this country, including gun-free zones, assault weapon bans, and concealed carry restrictions. In this section, I intend on showing that these gun control laws are against the natural rights of self-defense and revolt. As a reminder, regulation would be against the natural rights of self-defense and revolt if 1. The regulation takes away an individual's ability to defend themselves. 2. It's by reasonable means. And 3. In exercising the right, the individual will not be infringing on the natural right of another. That said, I will turn to the actual current gun control laws, the first being gun-free zones. The problem with gun-free zones is there is no legal definition of a gun-free zone, but the term is often used to describe places where the average person cannot legally carry a firearm. Schools are typically gun-free zones due to the Gun-Free School Zones Act, which prohibits all arms in all K-12 schools. But gun-free zones can also include courthouses, churches, airports, sports arenas, bars, and other places where alcohol is served. Even military bases have restrictions on carrying private arms. So if a place is a gun-free zone, that means you don't have to worry about being the victim of gun crime there, and thus would be no need for a gun for self-defense, right? Unfortunately not. Gun violence is routine in gun-free zones. Just think of the most recent deadliest shootings. Borderline Bar and Grill, Jacksonville Landing, which was the video game tournament shooting, the Las Vegas Country Festival shooting, the Douglas High School shooting, not to mention many not so publicized shootings as the one in Chicago Mercy Hospital. These all occurred in gun-free zones. In fact, even when I was writing this, another one just happened at a school. These all occurred in gun-free zones, and in fact, over 90% of public mass shootings take place in gun-free zones. Therefore, it appears that current gun-free zone laws have proven ineffective in deterring criminals. Big surprise. Intent on creating mass casualties from the carrying out of these shootings. However, what has been effective in doing is disarming the law-abiding citizen, thereby taking away not only a reasonable method of self-defense, but the law-abiding citizen's best method of self-defense. In all of these shootings, law-abiding citizens had no way to exercise their natural right of self-defense. The shooters were unopposed by rooms or large areas full of unarmed victims. The victims had no armed security to help them, no means of protection, and no choice to make other than how or where to run and hide. It is clear that these people were stripped of their natural right to self-defense as they were not afforded the best defense to an armed assailant, a gun. The government that stripped them of their natural right to self-defense was not there to protect them from the threat that was caused as a result of their defenselessness. Whether or not every individual even intended to carry a gun or use it is inconsequential. Natural rights are not forfeited if enough people do not choose to exercise them. The point is that every single person in those shootings were forbidden by law to exercise their natural right of self-defense, and because of that, were left totally defenseless, and many innocent people died. It should also be noted that if the individuals were armed and exercised their right to self-defense by shooting the perpetrator, they would not have violated the perpetrator's natural right to life because, of course, they were in the middle of committing an unprovoked act of violence. Accordingly, the obvious conclusion is that these types of gun-free zones, in the absence of any other means of protection, and I'll get into that point later, clearly violate an individual's natural right to self-defense. Assault weapon bans. Assault rifles are fully automatic rifles developed for military service. For example, the M16. And the 1986 Volkamer-McKeogh Act prohibited civilian ownership or purchase of any fully automatic weapon, including the AK-47, which is not a military adaptation, unless it was manufactured before May 1986. The term assault weapon versus assault rifle has no military or otherwise recognized official meaning. Therefore, it's clear that when individuals call for assault weapon bans, they are either referring to assault rifles but are not even informed enough to know what that means, or that they're already outlawed, or referring to some other type of weapon or group of weapons that aren't even assault rifles but are nonetheless capable of shooting multiple rounds without the need to reload. In analyzing public use of the term, it is generally used by gun control advocates in the media to reference semi-automatic firearms that might look like assault rifles but fire no faster than a revolver and function mechanically no differently than mass rifles used for hunting. So with that definition, we turn to the question of whether an assault ban takes away an individual's right to natural self-defense. Again, the ban would improperly take away the right to self-defense if 1. The regulation takes away an individual's ability to defend themselves, 2. By reasonable means, and 3. In exercising the right that an individual would not be infringing on another natural right of a person. Clearly, a gun ban of any sort takes away an individual's natural right to self-defense through the use of a gun. But is the use of an assault weapon a reasonable method of self-defense? The answer is yes. Contrary to public perception, these weapons are far less deadly than conventional hunting weapons. Like military assault rifles, semi-automatic assault weapons are designed to use down-powered ammunition due to the fact that incapacitating an enemy soldier requires far less power than does killing a large game with hunting weapons. As David Koppel points out in his rational basis analysis of assault weapon prohibition, quote, "The great irony of the claim that rifles labeled assault weapons are uniquely destructive is that they are only the rifles that have been designed not to kill humans. This accords with both the Hague Convention and the military theory, which is that wounding an enemy soldier uses up more of the side's resources to haul him off the battlefield and then care for him than does actually killing him." While gun control advocates cite instances like the one in Stockholm, California tragedy, in which 6 of the 35 people shot with an assault weapon died, for the need for assault weapon bans, they fail to note the more numerous instances in which ordinary hunting shotguns were used and ended up being far more deadly. Additionally, a ban on assault weapons will save a few lives or reduce crime as much as Additionally, a ban on assault weapons will save very few lives or reduce crime as 60% of public shootings are carried out with handguns alone, while assault weapons make up only around 10% of guns traced to crime. Even gun control advocates admit this, in fact. While testifying to the Congress, a Handgun Control Incorporated representative stated, "We agree with the NRA that assault weapons right now play a small role in overall violent crime. Furthermore, assault weapon bans are aimed at the wrong people who obey laws. Criminals don't obey laws, we know that. That's the definition of being a criminal. Especially in urban areas, a small number of violent offenders are typically responsible for the majority of gun violence. Additionally, in this perpetration of gun-related murders is often carried out by predictable people. According to the studies, almost all mass public shooters have an extensive history of mental health issues, disturbing behavior, and interpersonal violence. Most of these people, who can't or shouldn't be legally able to obtain a firearm. These aren't typical law-abiding people. While even if it were possible, disarming criminals of assault weapons would not have an extraordinary positive impact on gun-related crime, disarming law-abiding citizens of them would have a truly negative impact. Semi-automatic rifles are commonly used as self-defense weapons in the homes of law-abiding citizens because they are easy to control than handguns. They are far more versatile than handguns, and they offer an advantage of up to 30 rounds of protection. There are countless examples of AR-15 and other assault weapons being used effectively for self-defense without killing, and at times without even shooting the perpetrator. For example, in Oswego, Illinois last year, a man with an AR-15 intervened to stop a neighbor's knife attack and cited the larger weapon's, quote, intimidation factor, end quote, as the reason why the attacker dropped the knife. In Catawba, North Carolina last year, a 17-year-old successfully fought off 3 armed attackers with his AR-15. In Ferguson, Mississippi, 3 men protected another man's store from violent rioters by standing outside armed with AR-15s. In this case, stores that were not protected were not only looted, but individuals were physically hurt by these rioters. One quote that sums up much of this argument is from Cesar Beccaria, who talks about arms bans being a false idea of utility. Thomas Jefferson was influenced so much by this quote that he wrote it down in his personal compilation of great quotes. Beccaria says, quote, "False is the idea of utility that sacrifices thousands of real advantages for one, inconvenience. That would take away fire from men because it burns, and water because one may drown in it. It has no real remedy for evils except destruction. The laws that forbid carrying of arms are of such a nature. Such laws make things worse for the assaulted and better for the assailants. They serve rather encourage than to prevent homicides, for an unarmed man may be attacked with a greater confidence than an armed man. Therefore, it is clear that assault weapons are effective and reasonable methods of self-defense. Furthermore, it is clear that exercising the right to self-defense would be a criminal in the middle of a violent crime, would be justified, and would not be a violation of that criminal's right to life, as they forfeited that right in the commission of an often deadly crime. Accordingly, it is evident that an assault weapons ban violates an individual's natural right to self-defense. Additionally, we can't forget the benefits that the use of assault weapons would provide in the case of a revolutionary situation where there would be numerous individuals fighting numerous members of a military, and where there is no need for the concealment of a weapon. Concealed carry bans. States largely vary with regard to the rights of citizens to publicly carry guns that are concealed. In many states, gun control advocates and legislators are pushing stricter concealed carry laws and even concealed carry bans. This past year, stricter concealed carry legislation was passed in California, New Jersey, and proposed a federal concealed carry law that was defeated. This is in addition to the already strict concealed carry laws, as well as outright bans in some counties and cities, including New York City, as well as per se state bans. In locations with concealed carry bans, a citizen is not permitted to leave his home with a gun that is not readily visible. The state also has a ban on open carry. The citizen may not leave his home with a gun at all. In locations with concealed carry permit laws, a citizen without a concealed carry license can't leave home with a gun that is not visible. Although outright concealed carry bans are not typical in the US, they do exist. For instance, in New York City has a concealed carry ban for all citizens, very, very minor exceptions. Likewise, there are counties in Massachusetts, California with similar concealed carry bans. Furthermore, while New York, Hawaii, Maryland, and New Jersey are all technically may issue states, meaning that they have laws that allow for discretionary issuing of concealed carry permits, but they're basically no issue jurisdictions. In reality, because of the government policies directing officials with the discretionary power to rarely or never issue a license. For instance, in New York, in order to obtain a concealed carry permit, one must prove a necessity for the license. While self-defense is a permissible necessity, in order for it to be sufficient grounds for a license, one must prove that his need for self-defense is over and above the needs of an average citizen, which isn't even a real definition. Furthermore, if you live with someone as a part of the application process, you need to have that person's approval also. You need an affidavit from someone saying that they will agree to take your guns if you die. This individual also has to be able to legally own the guns. Even if you get over all of those hurdles, you can still be denied for some arbitrary reason. For example, one man was denied because he sniffled too much during his interview. The interviewer ruled that because of his excessive sniffling and clearing his throat, he was too nervous to obtain a license. And these are just a few examples of why the state is considered a per se no-issue state. Even if you are fortunate enough to obtain a concealed carry permit in the may-issue states, many of the states impose limitations on the concealed carry weapons permits, such as the type and the caliber of handguns that may be carried, restrictions on places and where the permit is valid, restricting concealed carry to purposes or activities specified on the approved permit application, and many others. Given that understanding of the nature and the scope of concealed carry license restrictions, we moved whether these infringe on an individual's right to self-defense. The answer is pretty obviously yes, especially in states that have these restrictions coupled with an open carry ban. If you can't carry a gun, you have little to no defense against an armed criminal. Like the analysis above regarding no gun zones, concealed carry bans just make up everywhere you go within that jurisdiction a no gun zone, leaving individuals deprived of the best tool of self-defense against an armed criminal. Furthermore, the analysis above, using a gun as self-defense against an armed criminal in the act of committing a violent crime, does not infringe upon their natural rights at all. Accordingly, a concealed carry ban and restrictions violate an individual's natural right to self-defense. Having analyzed three of the most modern and prevalent gun control measures, it is clear that they all violate natural law. Reply to the objections. Objection 1. While there was no right to self-defense under the natural law, this right is not absolute. When the individuals enter into society, they largely give up this right in return for the protection they obtain under the law. Accordingly, common sense gun legislation does not violate natural rights, but is indeed needed for the order of government to protect the citizens as a whole. I was just recapping what the first objection was, but the reply to it is the notion that the right to self-defense and revolution are not absolute is already conceded above in the analysis of the reasonable force under circumstances and the prohibition of violating another's natural right to life. However, in each case, it was also shown that the government could not provide protection to the individual citizen that would warrant the forfeit of natural right to self-defense. Furthermore, it might come out as a surprise to some people who only listen to public radio or certain news outlets, but they already are common sense gun laws in place, a lot of them. And just to give a few of them, the National Firearms Act of 1934, which makes it illegal for felons and convicted violent criminals to own a gun. The Gun Control Act of 1968, which is a federal law that prohibits the possession of firearms by any individual educated as a mentally deficient person who has been committed to a mental institution or has committed a felony, and others. The Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act of 1993 established the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, and it's an index of a database of criminal and mental health records that would disqualify an individual from purchasing or possessing a firearm due to various legal reasons. But however, due to various legal battles regarding this regulations and the state's assertion that they can't breach their citizens' right to privacy, many states do not disclose permanent records, especially mental health records that could otherwise be helpful in reducing crimes committed by individuals. So in this case, while the law is there, the mechanisms in place just aren't being adequately used by relevant authorities. Since there are literally thousands of state laws, I can't exactly go through every single one, but they include things like age restrictions, gun licensing laws, gun registries, and many others, all of which can be categorized as some kind of common sense law. I'm not conceding that all of them pass the natural law test, but they do exist. But the problem is that the average criminal is not abiding by them. Surprise. Criminals aren't really willing to surrender their guns and to find another line of business. Criminals aren't willing to suddenly become law-abiding people. How totally insane, right? And the overwhelming majority of guns used in crimes are not registered. In fact, recently statistics show that upwards of 80% of gun-related crimes are carried out with illegally obtained firearms. Although, as shown, there are countless common sense gun laws in place, you wouldn't know it, by the way, that some news outlets cover it. But for example, last year, CBS News ran a story entitled 5 Things That Are More Complicated Than Buying a Gun in Florida, implying that buying cold medicine, fertilizer, and anti-diarrhea medicine, obtaining a marriage license, or obtaining a medical marijuana card was more difficult than buying a gun. However, when you look at the facts in Florida, in order to purchase a firearm, an individual must provide photo identification, submit a social security number, prove that he is over the legal minimum age, pass a background check verifying that he is not a convicted felon, drug addict, or mentally incompetent, and if he doesn't have a concealed carry permit and is purchasing the handgun. wait 3 days after clearing all these hurdles to take possession of the weapon. Meanwhile, those only buying extremely large quantities of fertilizer, think enough to blow up a building, or extremely large and frequent amounts of anti-diarrhea medicine, think even more than a ton of people with irritable bowel syndrome would need. No one needs that. They're all restricted. And Florida residents obtaining a marriage license, cold medicine, or medical marijuana must only provide identification and be above the legal age. And for medical marijuana, have a prescription, but even that's debatable. They're not subjected to background checks, nor are felons or domestic violence misdemeanors prohibited from obtaining them. Giving this kind of misleading information, is it any wonder that the people repeating the common sense gun regulations need to be passed? The truth is that there are more than enough common sense gun laws in place, and that some not so common sense gun laws in place also exist among these. However, they are not being utilized effectively, or they would just not effectively stop crime. They would have eradicated it, they did not. Objection 2 was that although people retain the right to resist tyranny, this is a right that belongs to the community as a whole rather than the individuals. For these reasons, the natural rights tradition provides a more support for a collective right of gun ownership than an individual right. Reply to objection 2. In working on this thesis, I was surprised at how many advocated this position. It was even advocated in the Heller case, referenced at the start of my thesis. My first response to this would be, how does the community as a whole retain a right that an individual does not have? That is, in the case of tyranny, would there be a nationwide tyranny gun cabinets that have glass fronts that take a grip to break and are labeled break only in case of tyranny? I know that's ridiculous, but it's a reflective of the logic of this objection. The only government-sponsored collective guns is held by the military or the state police forces. There is no collective guns available to communities as a whole. Accordingly, it seems to say that the right to guns is only a collective right, as this would mean that only the government has the right to guns. How could you overthrow an armed party being entirely disarmed? Furthermore, like the right to self-defense or self-preservation, the right to a revolution can never be ceded to the government. In other words, in the words of James Wilson, the Declaration of Independence and a member of the Constitutional Convention, quote, "The natural law of self-preservation cannot be repealed or superseded or suspended by any human institution," end quote. Furthermore, the U.S. Supreme Court in the Heller case already decided this issue and found that the right to gun ownership for self-defense is an individual, not a collective right. In rare modern occurrence, they also used natural law principles to support this right. In the majority opinion, Justice Scalia quoted Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England, in which he referred to the natural right of resistance and self-preservation, which necessarily entailed the right of having and using firearms for self-defense and preservation. Accordingly, it's been proven both under natural law and by our current judicial branch that both the pursuant to natural law and the U.S. Constitution, the right to gun ownership is an individual right and not a collective one. Objection 3. Even if self-defense and the right to revolution are natural rights, guns are not reasonable or necessary to protect these rights, as we have other less dangerous protections, such as the police force and our political system. Reply to objection 3. The first police forces in America came into existence during the period between 1835 and 1845. They were established only to assist with citizen self-protection. It was never intended that they be primarily responsible to assist or act during criminal activity or violence against individual citizens. Their duty was to protect society as a whole by deterrence, by patrolling, by detecting and apprehending criminals after the occurrence of crimes. There was no thought of the police displacing the citizens' right of self-protection, and nor could they, even if they were intended. Just as in 1845, it's still true that police can't simply protect every individual citizen from harm. This level of protection would require the police be at any and every place a crime could possibly be committed, which is basically anywhere, at an instant. And there simply is not enough police officers to do this, and even if there were, I don't think that, like, you know, police officers everywhere would be a great idea. Even though, even today when a city has its own police force, these forces are still inadequate to protect all individual citizens. As Professor Don B. Cates Jr., an eminent civil rights lawyer and a criminologist states, quote, even if all 500,000 American police officers were assigned to patrol, they could not protect 240 million citizens from upwards of 10 million criminals who enjoy the luxury of deciding when and where to strike. But because we have nothing like 500,000 patrol officers to determine how many police are actually available for any one shift, we must divide the 500,000 by 4, 3 shifts per day, plus officers who have 2 days off or on sick leave, something like that. The resulting number must be cut in half to account for officers assigned to positions other than patrol. Statistics confirm that the police force in America cannot prevent violent crime, and according to the most recent FBI analysis statistics in 2017, there were an estimated 1,247,321 violent crimes, including 17,284 murders, and 319,356 violent robberies. All those crimes were unprevented and undeterred by police and the criminal justice system. Likewise, systems in place for the protection of citizens, such as the 911 system, are woefully inadequate. For example, on an average day, in one day, the San Francisco Police Department drops 150 calls to its 911 facility and about 1,000 calls to its general telephone number. And if you don't know what that means, the 150 people who called 911 on an average day are hung up on, or the call is never even answered. This is indicative of the countless and continuous examples of citizens calling the police for help and not receiving it. In a gun-free nation where the citizens would rely solely on the police for protection, there is no room for a drop rate. Furthermore, even if calls were for help answered, it's still impossible for every call to result in the provision of effective help. You may have heard the quote, when seconds count, the police were only minutes away. That's pretty much sums up this argument. Most violent crimes, as well as many active shooters and incidents, occur in a relatively short period of time. Most casualties occur in just a matter of minutes. Unfortunately, the average response time for law enforcement is far too long. Researchers found that less than 5% of calls dispatched to police are made quickly enough for officers to stop a crime or even arrest a suspect. Even then, the armed response is only as effective as the willingness of the armed responders to actually confront the shooter. We've seen this in the Parkland shooting, where people were killed because the first responder refused to enter the building and engage the shooter. As Richard Mack, former sheriff of Graham County, Arizona, has observed, quote, police do very little to prevent violent crime. We investigate crime after that, end quote. What these facts show is that it is painfully obvious that citizens can't rely solely on police forces for protection. An even more alarming fact that I learned from my research is that U.S. courts have found that police have no general duty to protect individuals, and judicial remedies are not available for their failure to protect. For example, in Warren versus the District of Columbia, the court stated that it is a fundamental principle of American law that government and its agents are under no general duty to provide public services such as police protection to any individual citizen. Another similar outcome arose in the Deshawney versus Winnebago County Department of Social Services. In that case, failure of the police to adequately respond to 2 911 calls resulted in armed attackers kidnapping, raping, and beating 3 women for 14 straight hours due to the brink of death. The court held that there was no duty owed by the police towards these 3 women because there was no special relationship. The court concluded that constitutional duties of care and protection only exist between the police and certain individuals, such as incarcerated prisoners or involuntary committed mental patients and others restrained against their will and therefore unable to protect themselves. The court noted that, quote, the affirmative duty to protect arises not from the state's knowledge of the individual's predicament or from its expression of the intent to help him, but from the limitation which has imposed on his freedom to act on his own behalf." End quote. Even more surprisingly, in the Ballesteri versus Pacifica Police Department, the court found that even with a restraining order in place, police didn't have the duty to protect a citizen who was supposedly protected by the restraining order. Thus, it's clear that the police force can't be used as a sole manner of personal protection, and therefore individuals must have access to the effective means of protecting their own lives, such as a gun. That is their natural right, and for the state to deprive them of the right is intrinsically evil. Under the natural law, nothing justifies doing what is intrinsically evil. Nothing. Therefore, no argument would justify preventing citizens from protecting themselves. In addition to our right to defend ourselves from violent criminals, we also have the natural right to resist a tyrannical government. While it is true that in most cases this will involve voting new leaders into utilizing the courts, it is not totally inconceivable that a government, even a government such as the US government, could become corrupt and turn on its own citizens, depriving them of the basic civil liberties. It's happened throughout the globe, as demonstrated earlier with Venezuela, but it's not the extent of it. In fact, almost 120 million unarmed civilians this century have been murdered by governments or by private groups acting as militias with government support or even encouragement. And while it's not probable that in the near future US citizens will need to resort to revolution in order to overthrow a tyrannical government, not only because of our current constitutional system of checks and balances, but because of also the sheer size and strength of the US military, that does not mean that the right to own guns for revolution is unnecessary. As Don Cates states in the Handgun Prohibition and the original meaning of the Second Amendment, quote, "The argument that an unarmed citizenry cannot hope to overthrow a modern military machine flies directly in the face of the history of Galera and the civil wars in the 20th century. Far from proving invincible, the vast majority of cases in this century in which they have confronted popular insurgencies, modern armies have been unable to suppress them. This is why the British no longer rule in Israel, and in Ireland, the French in Indochina, Algeria and Madagascar, the Portuguese in Angola, and the Shah in Nicaragua, etc. It is irrelevant for our purposes whether each of the struggles mentioned is or was justified, whether the people benefited. The fact remains that they were achieved against regiments equipped with all the military technology which is asserted inevitably dooms popular revolt. However, perhaps a more important in a free country like our own, the issue is not really overthrowing a tyranny, but deterring its institution in the first place, because it leads any prospective dictator to think that through such questions, the individual anonymous ownership of firearms is still a deterrent today to the despotism it originally intended to get rid of. Implicit in the Bill of Rights, as in the structure of our Constitution, the twin hallmarks of traditional liberty, trust in the people and distrust in the government. We are apt to forget these constant principles in light of our government's generally good record of exerting power without abusing it. But the deterrent effect of an unarmed citizenry is one little recognized factor that may have contributed to this. In the words of the late Senator Hubert Humphrey, quote, "The citizen's right to bear arms is one more guarantee against arbitrary government, one more safeguard against the tyranny which now appears in remote America, but which is historically proved to be always possible." End quote. In conclusion, you guys have all been waiting to hear that. It has been shown that under the precepts of natural law, we are all born with inalienable rights, and which cannot be separated from who we are. Among our natural rights is the primary right to self-defense. A person cannot justly demand another person's surrender of their natural rights, nor can a person agree to surrender their own natural rights, and therefore no person can demand another person to surrender their ability to defend themselves, nor can they surrender their natural right to self-defense. By extension, then, no one can justly demand another person surrender their natural right to a reasonable means of self-defense that an individual chooses to employ, including guns. Therefore, any gun control law that strips an individual of the right to self-defense, including the right to revolution, is a violation of the natural law, and as the Supreme Court noted in Heller, our Constitution is predicated on the principles of natural law, and thus natural law is still a pertinent and effective way to analyze the propriety of gun control legislation.